I stepped outside with a fresh cup of coffee and my favorite slippers, expecting the usual morning serenity of chirping birds and sunlight on my freshly mowed lawn, but instead, I sank ankle-deep into cold, squishy mud. I froze. My entire backyard looked like a scene from a disaster movie, with water pooling over my garden beds, the doghouse floating like a raft, and my prize rose bushes submerged in what could only be described as raw sewage soup. I let out a strangled noise, part gasp, part scream, as my dog waddled toward me, soaked, smelly, and dragging a half-drowned garden gnome in his mouth. That was the moment I knew. Someone was going to pay for this. And by someone, I meant Karen, the self-appointed dictator of our HOA, who once fined me for having non-regulation grass height. She had no idea that the man she just flooded was a civil engineer with a grudge, a basement full of tools, and an imagination darker than the cloud that had just burst over her little HOA empire. Just 48 hours earlier, my backyard had been a peaceful sanctuary. My wife and I had spent the weekend planting a new bed of heirloom tomatoes, laying down mulch, and setting up a brand new dog run for Max, our perpetually enthusiastic golden retriever. We'd even hosted a small neighborhood barbecue. Now, the only things enjoying my yard were the frogs that had seemingly migrated in overnight to claim it as their swampy new kingdom. I grabbed my boots, tossed my coffee aside, and stomped out to the fence line where I saw a steady stream of water gurgling from a mysterious PVC pipe that hadn't been there a week ago. It was pumping runoff like it had something to prove, funneling a small river directly into my property. I followed it uphill with my eyes and there it was, the new landscaping project the HOA had just completed around the community clubhouse. Brand new grass, pretty pavers, and, as it turned out, an unpermitted drainage pipe disguised under decorative rocks. My jaw clenched so tight I swear I cracked a molar. I stormed into the HOA office later that morning, dripping with mud and rage. Karen was perched behind the desk like a hawk on a power line, sipping from a white tumbler that read, HOA Life. No exceptions. She greeted me with a smile so fake it should have come with a receipt. Good morning. Can I help you? She said sweetly, already bracing for what she clearly expected to be a petty complaint. Karen, your runoff pipe is flooding my yard. My garden's gone, my dog smells like a sewage treatment plant, and there's literal wildlife moving in. What are you going to do about it? She blinked at me, then laughed, actually laughed. Oh, that's just nature, honey. It's runoff. Everyone gets a little soggy now and then. Think of it as free irrigation. Free irrigation? My left eye twitched. I wasn't sure if she was joking or if her HOA power had genuinely melted her brain. I filed a formal complaint this morning, I added through gritted teeth. Oh, did you? She said, spinning her chair toward a filing cabinet. She opened it, riffled through exactly 2 folders, and turned back to me with a shrug. Doesn't seem like we have it on file. I stared at her in disbelief. I submitted it online. I have the timestamp. Oh, the online system's been a bit quirky. Maybe next time print it out. I left before I said something that would get me sued. But I didn't go home defeated, I went home to plan. Because what Karen didn't know was that I used to design municipal drainage systems. I understood slope, pressure, fluid velocity, and flow mechanics. She'd built a cheap, lazy solution and pointed it downhill. Toward me. Big mistake. The first step was gathering intel. I spent the next evening perched in my backyard with binoculars, a flashlight, and a notebook, watching the runoff pipe spew its constant, bubbling stream into my property. I took photos, measurements, calculated volume and flow rate. I mapped out the exact route the pipe had taken from the new clubhouse landscaping project. It was sloppy. It was illegal. And most importantly, it was traceable. That's when I got a knock on my back gate. It was Dave, my neighbor from 2 doors down, the quiet guy who kept to himself and brewed his own kombucha. Hey man, he said, eyeing my notebook. You tracking that pipe too? Apparently, I wasn't the only one who noticed. Dave had done some recon of his own and discovered that the HOA had skipped city approval for their new drainage plan. The contractors had used old materials, no permits, and connected everything to a pipe that dumped runoff straight down the neighborhood incline. He even had drone footage from a few days earlier showing workers burying the pipe in a hurry. You should see what they did to the Wilsons' yard. Their koi pond overflowed and dumped fish all over the patio. I thanked him and made a mental note to buy that man a beer. With Dave's footage, my calculations, and a growing sense of justified fury, I knew exactly what needed to happen next. Karen had used my yard as a dump site. She had laughed in my face. It was time to show her that water flows both ways. I didn't want just revenge. I wanted engineering-grade vengeance. Silent, precise, and absolutely, undeniably legal. I went down to my garage, pulled out my old drafting equipment, rolled out a fresh sheet of paper, and began sketching. Not just a fix, an operation. I was going to reroute every drop of that runoff, and when I was done, Karen's precious HOA pool was going to get a taste of its own medicine. As I worked into the night under the hum of my desk lamp, a single thought kept me going. If they wanted to flood me out, fine. Let's see how they liked it when the tide turned. The next morning, I was up before sunrise, standing in my garage with a cup of strong coffee and the blueprint I had drawn the night before. My workshop was a monument to my past life, civil engineering awards collecting dust on the shelves, an old roll of surveyor's tape draped over a filing cabinet, and enough tools to repipe a small city. I hadn't used most of them in years. Retiring early was supposed to mean peace and weekends spent in the garden. But now, thanks to Karen and her HOA of doom, I had a new purpose, and frankly, I hadn't felt this alive in years. I started by installing a discrete grading line across the lowest point of my yard to divert surface runoff. That was the visible part, the one I'd show if anyone from the HOA came snooping. Beneath it, though, I began digging a narrow trench that would connect to a stormwater capture system I disguised as a gardening shed. Inside the structure, I laid down heavy-duty piping leading to a buried tank. The whole setup looked like a slightly obsessive composting operation from above, but underground it was the beginning of a masterfully engineered revenge. As I worked, I realized I needed eyes on the neighborhood, not just for protection but for timing. That's when I remembered the drone my nephew had given me last Christmas, still unopened in the closet. I spent the evening getting it up and running, and before long, I had aerial surveillance of the entire HOA grounds. From the air, I could see the exact layout of their makeshift drainage system and how badly it was cobbled together. Even better, I spotted something new. A team of landscapers working behind the clubhouse, clearly still modifying the runoff channels. So they knew something was wrong. That made them dangerous, but also sloppy. To avoid drawing attention, I added a few fake improvements to my yard to serve as camouflage. A new stone path that conveniently concealed a pump intake, a raised planter bed that hid a control valve. I labeled things Organic Irrigation Zone and Wildflower Restoration Project to scare off nosy neighbors with environmental buzzwords. But Karen wasn't so easily fooled. It started with a note left on my door, written in looping cursive and signed, the HOA board, but we all knew that meant Karen. It read, "Unpermitted structures may be subject to review. Please contact the office to schedule an inspection." I crumpled it and tossed it straight into the trash. The next day, two of Karen's best friends, Carol and Marge, aka the neighborhood's unofficial surveillance unit, showed up while I was weeding near the front yard. They had clipboards, sunglasses, and smiles that looked more like smirks. "Just doing a routine visual assessment," Carol chirped. "Looks like you've been doing some digging," Marge added, peering over the fence like a meerkat with a grudge. "Just improving drainage," I said, wiping sweat off my brow and playing dumb. "All perfectly allowed under Section 6.2.1 of the HOA bylaws. Want me to print you a copy?" They didn't respond, but I saw one of them scribble something down. Probably, acts smug under questioning. I gave them a cheerful wave as they waddled off in search of their next victim. I knew I'd need evidence in case Karen tried anything legal. So I reviewed the drone footage from the past week and struck gold. I captured a maintenance worker walking around the clubhouse at night, unlocking a valve on the pipe system connected to the runoff. Moments later, my backyard camera picked up the spike in flow. The HOA wasn't just ignoring the problem. They were deliberately dumping more water into my property to relieve pressure elsewhere. That was the nail in their coffin. Meanwhile, I applied for a modification permit from the city for my drainage renovations. The process was surprisingly straightforward, especially when I explained the situation to the city engineer, who laughed and said, "Sounds like your HOA took the cheap route." He approved my permit within 48 hours. I posted it proudly in my front window for Karen and her minions to see. The real surprise came 2 days later when a notice from the city appeared on the HOA office door. A formal warning for unauthorized stormwater alterations, citing multiple violations and threatening fines. I had sent the city engineer the drone footage anonymously through the public complaint portal. Karen must have lost her mind when she saw it. I almost felt bad. Almost. I expected retaliation, and I wasn't disappointed. Karen came storming down my walkway like a suburban hurricane, flanked by Carol and Marge. She was wearing her signature wide-brimmed hat and clutching a folder filled with HOA papers like a battle flag. "We need to talk," she said, her tone somewhere between furious and faux polite. "I'd invite you in, but it looks like you didn't schedule an appointment," I said, gesturing to the permit in the window. Her nostrils flared. "You've created a hostile environment with your unauthorized surveillance and aggressive behavior." "Karen," I replied calmly, "you flooded my property. I have the evidence. I've gone through every legal channel. And if you try anything else, I'll go to the local news. I hear they love HOA drama." She sputtered but didn't say anything else. Just stormed off with her entourage in tow, probably to regroup and scheme. But it didn't matter. I had the permit. I had the footage. I had the plan. And most importantly, I had the knowledge that soon, very soon, the water that had turned my yard into a swamp would be taking a little field trip, straight into the place Karen held most dear. The HOA's perfectly maintained, regulation temperature, members-only pool. I spent the next 2 days finishing the reroute. Everything was ready. The holding tank I had installed beneath the shed would gradually release water through a high-efficiency pipe that ran under the fence, through an unused easement, and connected directly to a drainage intake that fed into the clubhouse's pool filtration overflow. It was genius. The system mimicked natural flow, was completely untraceable, and technically fell within legal stormwater routing guidelines. Karen could call in the National Guard and still wouldn't find anything that violated code. With the final valve sealed and the system live, I walked into my now dry backyard and took a deep breath. Max the dog ran circles through the grass, happy to have his turf back. My wife peeked out from the kitchen window and gave me a thumbs up. I sipped my coffee with satisfaction. Revenge wasn't just sweet, it was hydraulically optimized. Now all I had to do was wait. And when the next rainfall hit, which, according to the forecast, would be in 2 days, the HOA pool was going to get a whole lot more character. The rain came on schedule, just as the forecast predicted. It began with a soft drizzle, harmless and almost pleasant, the kind of weather that makes you want to curl up with a good book and a cup of tea. But by midnight, it turned into a full-on storm. Thunder cracked across the sky like a whip, and sheets of rain poured down in endless waves, soaking everything in sight. I sat in my garage, the glow of my monitoring system lighting up the workbench, tracking every inch of rainfall as it hit my property. The system worked beautifully. My yard stayed dry. Water entered the trench, flowed into the underground tank, and then, with the precision of a Swiss watch, began its slow journey back out, right toward the HOA clubhouse. It was almost poetic. For every gallon that had once flooded my garden, One now flowed toward Karen's precious oasis. I watched through my drone feed as the pipe did its silent work beneath the earth, redirecting the runoff through the hidden pathway and releasing it into the clubhouse's filtration overflow. At first, it was undetectable, just a few extra gallons in the system. But I knew what was coming. I had designed it that way. By morning, the skies cleared, leaving behind a neighborhood soaked but intact. I stepped out onto my patio, dry as a bone, while the birds chirped like nothing had happened. Max bounded past me, chasing a squirrel, and I gave the shed a satisfied glance. The job was done, and now, the real fun would begin. That weekend marked the grand HOA Summer Splash Bash, an annual event Karen treated like her personal coronation. She'd sent out glittery flyers weeks in advance, promising live music, catered hors d'oeuvres, and poolside cocktails. Every family in the neighborhood was invited, well, everyone except me. I had received a note that said, "Due to your ongoing noncompliance and hostility toward HOA operations, your invitation has been rescinded. Thank you for understanding." I laughed when I read it. Karen really believed she still had control of the narrative. The morning of the event, I sent the drone up again. From above, the clubhouse pool sparkled in the sun. White deck chairs were perfectly aligned, paper lanterns dangled from pergolas, and Karen stood by the gate in a wide-brimmed sun hat, greeting guests like royalty. What none of them noticed was the subtle change in the water's color. A barely perceptible greenish tint, the early sign of what happens when storm water meets chlorine without proper filtration. By noon, kids were jumping in, splashing around, and squealing with joy. Parents relaxed with margaritas. The DJ played bad 80s remixes. And then it started. A kid climbed out of the pool and sneezed 5 times in a row. Another scratched his arms like he had poison ivy. Someone shouted, "What's that smell?" and pointed at the shallow end, where a suspicious film had begun to form on the surface. Karen, ever the image-conscious queen, rushed over to inspect and claimed it was just pollen. Then the pump made a sound. A low, mechanical groan that turned into a sputtering hiss, followed by a loud clunk. The fountain feature shut off. The jets stopped bubbling. People began stepping out of the water, noses wrinkling, murmuring to each other. A toddler held up what looked like a tiny worm and asked, "Is this a noodle?" Within 20 minutes, half the party had cleared out. A few guests stayed, still clutching their drinks like they could pretend the pool wasn't slowly turning into a pond. But when the clubhouse maintenance guy arrived and opened the filtration panel, he found the intake clogged with silt, plant matter, and small bits of organic debris. One of the guests gagged when he saw it. Another took a photo and posted it to the neighborhood Facebook group. I watched it all unfold from the comfort of my dry deck, sipping sweet tea with my wife while Max snored under the table. The post blew up within the hour. Parents demanded to know why the pool wasn't tested before the event. One neighbor claimed their daughter had an ear infection. Someone else accused the HOA of hiding maintenance issues. Karen tried to defend herself in the comments, but she was quickly drowned out by angry residents posting pictures of their kids with red eyes and rashes. That night, the pool was officially closed. A notice went out citing mechanical issues due to unforeseen environmental factors. I couldn't have worded it better myself. The next few days were filled with glorious silence. No HOA drones buzzing over my property. No Carol or Marge walking their yappy dogs past my house 3 times a day. Just peace. But I knew the silence wouldn't last. Karen wasn't the type to take humiliation lightly. Sure enough, on the 4th day, I spotted her pacing the edge of the clubhouse with a clipboard and 2 maintenance guys in tow. She was pointing at various parts of the property, barking orders, and looking increasingly unhinged. My drone picked up audio from the scene. "Find the source. Someone's sabotaging us. This isn't normal runoff." That last line made me laugh. She was right. It wasn't normal. It was engineered. But her crew had no idea where to start. The system I'd built was invisible, legal, and routed through a city-approved permit. Even if they traced every pipe, they'd never find the connection. I had used an old easement no longer recorded on modern HOA blueprints, an oversight Karen would have noticed if she spent more time reading and less time hosting pool parties. Later that evening, a friend of mine who lived closer to the clubhouse told me Karen had tried calling an emergency board meeting. Half the members didn't show. The ones who did were furious. The HOA was facing pressure from the city about the original illegal drainage setup, and now the residents were blaming them for health issues. Rumors spread that some families were considering a class action lawsuit. And just like that, the power Karen held so tightly began to slip. I received a knock at my door that night. It was Dave again, holding a six-pack of beer and a grin so wide it barely fit his face. "You're not gonna believe this," he said. "Karen got served." I blinked. "Like, legally?" He nodded. "Some residents filed a formal complaint with the city attorney. They're alleging negligence, misuse of funds, and failure to report environmental hazard. She was redder than a fire hydrant." I cracked open a beer and handed one to Dave. We clinked bottles. "Justice tastes good," I said. But I wasn't done. Not yet. The pool was just the beginning. Karen had flooded my yard, destroyed my garden, and tried to bully me into silence. I had fought back with engineering and patience, but the real storm was still coming. Because now people were asking questions, and when they found the answers, the entire foundation of her little HOA kingdom was going to crumble. The days following the pool party disaster were deliciously chaotic. The once ironclad grip Karen held over the neighborhood began to crack like cheap porcelain. What used to be a rain of HOA newsletters and passive-aggressive warning letters had devolved into frantic emails, urgent meetings, and residents finally finding their spines. The neighborhood Facebook group, once a sleepy place for lost pet posts and bake sale promotions, had become an active war zone of finger-pointing, screenshots, and all-caps rant. And there I was, just watching the flames from the sidelines, roasting metaphorical marshmallows with every new comment thread. Karen, of course, attempted damage control. She claimed the pool contamination was an act of nature and accused the maintenance team of negligence. She tried to deflect attention by proposing random rule changes, something about limiting the number of garden gnomes per household and regulating trash bin color, but no one was biting. People were too busy uploading photos of cloudy pool water and comparing medical bills. The damage was done. And then came the best part. Someone finally asked the big question in a public post. Who authorized the rerouted runoff into the lower yards in the first place? That question triggered a wave of investigation. A few board members, apparently sensing the tide had turned, started to distance themselves from Karen. One of them, a guy named Thomas who had always seemed like a reluctant participant in Karen's HOA cult, slid a plain manila envelope under my front door one evening. Inside were copies of emails, invoices, and permits, or rather, the lack thereof. It was a paper trail of shortcuts, cover-ups, and deliberate ignorance. One email stood out. Karen had written it herself to a local contractor, telling them to just handle the water issue and do whatever is cheapest. No need to involve the city. That was the smoking gun. I didn't post it myself. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I handed it to a neighbor who had already been vocal online and let him take the lead. Within hours, the documents were posted, shared, and dissected by every angry parent and furious homeowner in the subdivision. It was like tossing gasoline onto a bonfire. The next board meeting was no longer optional, it was a full-on tribunal. The clubhouse parking lot was packed the night of the meeting. Folding chairs filled the room, and neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder in the back, many holding printed-out screenshots like pitchforks. Karen sat at the front table, surrounded by what remained of the board, looking like a dethroned queen who hadn't yet accepted her fate. She wore her signature pastel blazer and clutched a binder to her chest like it might protect her from the wrath of 100 angry taxpayers. The meeting started cordially enough. Then the floodgates opened, pun fully intended. Parents recounted how their children got sick after swimming in the contaminated pool. Gardeners showed photos of drowned flower beds. One elderly resident accused the runoff of attracting mosquitoes that forced her back on blood pressure med. Karen tried to respond, but each time she spoke, someone interrupted with another damning detail. The moment that sealed her fate came when a dad stood up, held out a laminated copy of her incriminating email, and said, "You gambled with our homes to save a few bucks." Her reply? A stammering, condescending non-apology about unforeseen complications and being misunderstood. That's when the vote was called. One by one, hands raised across the room. It wasn't even close. Karen was voted off the board, effective immediately. Some people clapped. Others just stood in stunned silence, the kind that comes after watching a dictator fall. Karen gathered her things and left without a word, her high heels clicking against the tile like a punctuation mark on her downfall. In the aftermath, the board was restructured. Thomas, the quiet whistleblower, was appointed interim president. He approached me the next morning, hat in hand, asking for help. "I know you're the one who figured all this out," he said. "We'd really appreciate it if you could advise us on how to fix the drainage issue for good." It was tempting to say no, to let them dig themselves out of the mess they ignored. But honestly, I wanted the runoff gone as much as anyone. So I agreed, on the condition that they allow me full oversight and transparency. They signed off on it. The new board submitted plans to the city, hired a legitimate engineering team, and began rerouting the entire drainage system through legal, regulated pathways that didn't involve dumping water on private property. My yard, for the first time in weeks, stayed completely dry without the help of my secret project. But not everything was resolved. Karen, now just a bitter former board president, decided to take one last shot. I received a notice from her lawyer claiming I had committed malicious property interference and demanding I remove unauthorized modifications to neighborhood infrastructure. She wanted to sue me for water damage to the pool, claiming my yard work had somehow disrupted the ecological balance. It would have been hilarious if it weren't so insane. Thankfully, I had prepared for this. I responded with a detailed counterclaim, complete with drone footage, timestamps, and copies of every permit and document that showed my compliance. I also filed a small claims suit of my own for damages to my yard, emotional distress, and the cost of restoring my garden. Karen never showed up to the hearing. Her lawyer quietly withdrew the complaint, and a week later, I received a court order requiring her to pay a modest settlement. Not much money, but it was enough to buy a new patio set, repair the irrigation system, and throw a party that would make her head spin. Before the month was over, Karen put her house up for sale. Rumor had it she was moving to a retirement community 2 towns over, one where the HOA was run by retired military officers who actually followed bylaws. Good luck, Karen. The cherry on top? I found out who bought her house. A water rights attorney who specialized in residential property law and loved koi pond. I nearly fell out of my chair laughing when I read the "Welcome to the Neighborhood" postcard with a little fish graphic in the corner. As for me, life finally returned to normal. The garden bloomed again. Max rolled in the grass like he'd never known a soggy day. And the new board actually started listening to residents. They even invited me to join. I declined, but I promised to help whenever they needed engineering advice. As long as they didn't try to find me for my gnomes. Because if there was one thing I learned, it was this: never underestimate the power of a quiet neighbor with a toolbox, a drone, and a very good reason to fight back. Peace had a new sound in my neighborhood. It wasn't the chirping of birds or the quiet hum of sprinklers, although those returned too. No, it was the absence of passive-aggressive emails, the silence where Karen's voice used to echo through every HOA meeting, every mailbox notice, every unsolicited conversation about hedge height and front porch symmetry. With her gone, the community breathed easier. People smiled more, stopped policing lawn ornaments, and even started talking to each other without clutching the rulebook like it was the Constitution. And me? I was finally living the retirement I'd earned, without worrying that stormwater would turn my tomatoes into swamp bubbles. I had a barbecue the weekend after Karen officially moved out. My wife helped me hang string lights in the yard, and I rolled out the new patio furniture bought with the settlement money she paid me in quiet defeat. Neighbors filtered in one by one, each bringing a dish or a six-pack or a relieved grin. Dave brought his infamous garlic wings. The Wilsons brought homemade lemonade and their rebuilt koi pond stories. Thomas even brought a small plaque he had made as a joke. In honor of the Great Drainage War, victory achieved by engineering, grit, and a touch of petty. I hung it right over my garden shed. Everyone gathered in a circle around the grill as the sun dipped below the rooftop. For once, there were no HOA board members inspecting fence colors, no one measuring grass blades with a ruler, and definitely no one handing out citations for unapproved lighting. It was just people enjoying a moment that felt earned. I stood there, flipping burgers, smiling like I hadn't in months. Because not only had I fixed the runoff problem, not only had I sent Karen packing, but I had somehow helped reset the soul of this place. Of course, I didn't tell anyone that the secret rerouting system was still functional. I hadn't shut it off completely, only adjusted it. Now it acted more like a contingency, a backdoor failsafe in case someone else decided to get creative with drainage again. I figured it was like installing a security camera. You hope you never need it, but it's good to have when things go sideways. Then, just when I thought the story had wrapped itself up with a neat little bow, a new twist emerged. About a week after the barbecue, I got a knock at my door. A woman stood there, holding a clipboard, dressed in business casual, and wearing the faint expression of someone who had read far too many legal documents that day. "Hi," she said, offering a professional smile. "I'm Sandra. I just closed on the house at the corner, used to be Karen's place." I blinked, suddenly connecting the dots. The water rights attorney. This was her. "I hope I'm not bothering you," she added. "I've been reviewing the property files and the HOA's handling of stormwater management. Some of it doesn't exactly add up." I invited her in, and we sat at the kitchen table as she opened a folder thicker than a Sunday newspaper. She wasn't just casually aware of the situation, she had studied it like a case file. Apparently, Karen's house had a partial tie-in to the original runoff system, one that was technically outside her property line but still impacted her backyard. Sandra wanted to restore the landscape, maybe even install a small koi pond, but needed assurance that no hidden flood pipes would turn her dream yard into a wetland. So, I told her the story. Not every gritty detail, but the broad strokes, what the HOA had done, how they'd covered it up, how the system had nearly turned half the neighborhood into a retention basin. She listened intently, took notes, and didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she leaned back and smiled. "I suspected as much," she said. "You did all that without breaking a single rule. That's impressive." Then she asked to see the shed. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. We walked out back, and I opened the door to the structure I'd built like a Trojan horse. She stepped inside, examined the layout, looked over the control valves and the filtration system, and whistled softly. "This is cleaner than some of the systems I've seen in court cases," she said. "You've got real skill." We stood in the yard a while longer, talking shop. I hadn't expected to meet someone who actually enjoyed water system design the way I did, but there she was, enthusiastically throwing around terms like infiltration basins and flow regulation like it was poetry. Eventually, she looked around and said something that made me laugh. "You know, this neighborhood might finally be worth saving." Over the next few weeks, Sandra joined the HOA board. Not as a dictator or a power-hungry tyrant, but as an actual legal advisor. She cleaned up the bylaws, shut down any lingering loopholes, and ensured that never again would someone reroute a drainage pipe just to save a few bucks. The board meetings became shorter, less dramatic, and refreshingly productive. I even showed up to one, just for fun, and no one glared at me. I spent the fall rebuilding the last parts of the yard that had been damaged. I expanded the garden, planted new roses, and upgraded the dog run for Max, who now had his own little splash pad. My wife added a hammock between two trees and finally got her outdoor reading nook. Every now and then, neighbors would stop by, ask about the plants, or share some small update. It felt like a community again, not a battleground. One morning, months later, as the first frost hit the ground and turned the lawn silver, I stood on the patio holding a warm mug and looked around at the yard that had once been a swamp. And I thought about everything that had happened, the sabotage, the lies, the quiet war fought with pipes and permits. I remembered Karen's smug face as she told me to be grateful for free irrigation. And I remembered the pool party that became a cautionary tale. But more than anything, I remembered the moment I decided to fight back. Not with anger, not with lawsuits or shouting matches, but with skill, strategy, and a bit of perfectly measured spite. That's the thing about water. People think it just flows wherever it wants, that it's impossible to control. But with the right planning, it can go exactly where you send it. Even if that place is directly into an entitled HOA president's pool. The neighborhood had changed. And maybe I had too. I was no longer just the quiet retiree who liked to garden. I was the guy who beat the HOA at their own game and then helped fix what they broke. In the end, revenge hadn't just been satisfying, it had helped rebuild a better place for all of us. And somewhere, probably in a very tightly managed community with color-coded trash bins and leaf blowers scheduled by time slot, Karen was probably still trying to figure out how her sparkling pool had turned into a murky symbol of her downfall. I hoped she found peace. But mostly, I hoped she stayed far away from plumbing.